By the summer of 1950, the United States Armed Forces were but a shadow of what they had been at the end of World War II. With the exception of the European Constabulary, none of the American armed forces were up to authorized strength. Most equipment was of World War II vintage and suffered from old age. To make matters worse, the South Korean Air Force was almost non-existent. A few modern American combat aircraft had reached the Far East by mid-1950. Under Truman's orders, USAF C-54s hurriedly evacuated American citizens from Seoul.
Some of the things that he did, like ordering the Air Force to help liberate American citizens out of South Korea, he did without congressional approval. Although nobody ever told Truman that he was wrong, people were so shocked they pretty much went right along with it. So there was some interesting things that he did do as a president. But he said, I want to make this a UN issue and not an American issue. But if the UN refuses, then we will deal with it.
Unfortunately, the only combat aircraft immediately available in the theater were a small number of F-80C Shooting Star jet fighter bombers and some obsolescent North American F-82 twin Mustang piston-engine fighters. The inability of the ROK ground forces to defend their own territory was such that the Communists made swift progress southwards. Seoul and its airfields fell on June 28 as the South Korean army retreated in disarray. At a time in history when there were 10 commercial flights a week across the Pacific, the military air transport service began to run 30 trips a day. 206 aircraft, working constantly, bridged the Pacific from North America to Japan. 3 months after the war's outbreak in September 1950, the Pacific Airlift was flying 250,000 miles a day, Sundays included. The Combat Cargo Command moved the tons of supplies and thousands of soldiers from Japan into the Korean battle zone, while the American and South Korean troops were being driven back to the Pusan perimeter. Realizing that the immediate need was for ground support from the air, the United States quickly moved 3 wings of F-51 Mustangs to the theater, aircraft which proved excellent in the ground attack role. At the same time, the F-80s were assigned to the air combat role. As the UN command frantically assembled ground forces with which to stem the communist advance, USAF strength in the theater quickly increased. Japan-based B-26 light and B-29 heavy bombers joined aircraft of the U.S. Navy in raids on the North Koreans. The Marines flew the first ground support strikes of the war on August 3rd, with VMF 214 sending 8 F-4U Corsairs flying close air support for U.S. and Republic of Korea soldiers near Pusan. By August 7th, VMFs 214 and 323 were flying continuous close air support sorties ahead of the Marine and Army troops on the ground. The World War II vintage Corsair, armed with rockets and napalm, were an effective combination throughout the entire war. Short-legged jets could not loiter above the battlefield, and airfields in-country were not yet available. Flying from carriers allowed more on-station time. Thus it fell to the veteran Leatherneck Corsairs to carry the war in the beginning. The Marines had developed close air support during the Philippine campaign of January 1945 and made this coordination between aircraft and requesting ground units their own special field of operations.
But the Marine Corps is really the only service that is totally self-supporting. We have our ground troops, we have our helicopters to get them in and get them out, we have our jets that provide close air support and make strategic strikes. And we don't have to really, well, I guess we rely on the Navy to get us there to venues where we need to be. But we basically support our own.
By September, all but a small area around Pusan in the extreme southeast had been overrun by the invaders, and almost all air operations were launched from U.S. carriers at sea and long-range bombers from Japan. Resupplied and tired of running, it was now time for the UN forces in Korea to strike back. Supreme Commander General MacArthur's counterattack combined a breakout from the Pusan perimeter with a brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon. The B-29s started softening up Incheon a few days before the landing. Their mission was twofold. One was to neutralize the enemy ground forces and to attack all Korean airfields in enemy hands. The B-29s flew more than 3,000 sorties. On September 15th, the legendary 1st Marine Division led the first major UN force strike in North Korean-occupied territory, backed by aircraft from the fast carriers Philippine Sea, Valley Forge, and Boxer, the escort carriers Ben Dong Strait and Sicily, and the Royal Navy's Triumph. The Marines quickly secured the island.
That was kind of a tenuous operation, to say the least, because apparently Incheon has a very shallow port, and it restricts the use of amphibious operations to a few hours a day. So you had to, number one, time your landing, and then when they got there, I think that instead of landing on a beach, they literally had to scale walls to get there.
General MacArthur ordered 8th Army Commander Lieutenant General Walton Walker to break out of the Pusan perimeter 1 day after the landings at Incheon. Hammered by tanks, artillery, and fighter bombers, the North Koreans retreated in disarray. In 5 days of textbook-style campaigning, the division broke out and closed on the approaches of Seoul, the South Korean capital. By the end of September, the North Korean army had essentially ceased to exist, and UN forces were within 5 miles of the 38th parallel, all along the line. Pounded from the ground and air, the once powerful armored units of the NKP Army left 239 destroyed or abandoned T-34-85 on the field. The Korean War was the first war in which jet aircraft played a central role. Once formidable fighters, such as the P-51 Mustang, F-4U Corsair, and Hawker Sea Fury, all piston-engined, propeller-driven, and designed during World War II, relinquished their air superiority roles to a new generation of faster, jet-powered fighters arriving in the theater. Emerging from World War II as one of the most potent fighting arms on the planet, the U.S. recognized that the day of the piston-engine fighter was drawing to a close. Having supplied the Navy and Marines with the Tiger Cat and Bearcat, Grumman began design work on a carrier-based fighter to rival the McDonnell F-H-1 Phantom. A conventional design with straight wings and excellent low-speed characteristics, the first of 567 F-9Fs reached the flight line in 1949. They were none too soon. Monday morning, July 3rd, 1950. The Korean War was just 10 days old. On the Yellow Sea, 180 miles southwest of Incheon, the USS carrier Valley Forge steamed north at high speed toward the 38th parallel. At 9:35 hours, she began launching aircraft. Jet engines began winding up from a high-pitched scream to a thunderous roar, and one by one the catapults shot them forward and off the deck, clawing for altitude. The third aircraft away was flown by Lieutenant Leonard Plugg. The fourth was his wingman, Ensign E.W. Brown. 2 hours, 20 minutes later, the pair was over Pyongyang, North Korea in their Grumman Panthers. Their mission was to ride shotgun for various Allied piston engine aircraft, which were sent to wreak havoc on the enemy airfield located there. Spying a pair of Russian-built Yak-9 piston engine aircraft taking off from one of the airfields under attack, Plugg and Brown nosed over to challenge them. Plugg pulled up on the tail of one Yak, only to discover tracers flying past him from another enemy at 6. Pulling back hard on the stick, he was relieved to see the tracers falling away from him as Brown slid neatly astern of the antagonist. He squeezed the trigger and put a stream of 20mm cannon shells across the Yak from the top of the fuselage, just behind the canopy, to about midway out on the left wing. There was a terrible explosion, and the Yak disintegrated before his eyes. Pieces of the Yak were scattered over a large area of the frosty Korean landscape. It was the very first kill by a Grumman Panther. The sleek Panther would soon be performing almost half of all attack missions for the Navy and Marine Corps.
I think they were called F-6. They were jets. They flew jets, bomber fighters, small. They carried, I think, 2 bombs, and they'd go out on a run, bomb whatever they're supposed to, and then look for somebody to shoot at on the way home. Every once in a while, a guy would come back and zip over the base because he'd made a kill on the way home.
A Marine airfield was a busy place. As fast as American industry could build them, Devil Dog's air power was sent to Korea. The balance would shift, however, with the arrival of the swept-wing Soviet MiG-15. On November 1st, 1950, Chinese air power suddenly entered the war in a dangerous way. In the steel gray skies over North Korea, the first Russian-built MiG-15 Faggot appeared, one of the most advanced jet fighters of the day. The fast, heavily armed MiG outflew first-generation UN jets, such as the American F-80 and Australian and British Gloster Meteors, posing a real threat to the B-29 Superfortress bombers, even under fighter escort. Soviet Air Force pilots flew missions for the North to learn the West's aerial combat techniques. This direct Soviet participation is a justification for war that the UN command deliberately overlooked, lest the war for the Korean Peninsula expand, as the U.S. initially feared to include 3 communist countries, North Korea, the Soviet Union, and China, and so escalate to atomic warfare. In 1950, the F-86 was under development, but was not battle-ready. The best jet available at the time was the F-80. It was a good aircraft, but on paper, no match for the MiG-15s. They were like lightning. At first, the MiG-15 pilots simply flew along the Yalu River in an effort to tempt American aircraft into Chinese airspace. But on November 8th, a section of 4 of the communist jets ventured too far and were boxed in by 4 F-80s, and in the first all-jet air combat in history. In late October, the 1st Marine Division made an unopposed landing at Wonsan on the East Coast, which initiated UN operations in Northeast Korea and established security for the port of Wonsan. The division was then ordered to advance northwest of Hungnam along a mountain road to the Chosin Reservoir, the site of an important hydroelectric plant. The Marines would then advance to the Yalu River and the border between North Korea and the People's Republic of China. Despite intelligence in early November that Chinese Communist forces were massing in force across the Yalu River, the 1st Marine Division was ordered to continue its progress northwest from Hungnam to the Chosin Reservoir. On November 27th, elements of the Chinese Communist People's Liberation Army struck Marine positions in force. In a carefully planned counterstroke, 8 Chinese divisions charged down from surrounding mountains with the express mission of destroying the Marines.
Literally, the Chinese surrounded the Marines, the 1st Marine Division, up near the Chosin Reservoir, up in the mountains. There's a guy by the name of Chesty Puller that you might have heard of, and Chesty Puller is kind of a legend in the Marine Corps. He's the most decorated Marine that ever lived. He had 52 personal decorations, including 5 Navy Crosses. And it is said, probably out of context and maybe embellished a little bit, that he called in. He was calling into headquarters, and they asked him for a situation report. And he says, "I got Chinese communists on my right, I got Chinese communists on my left, I got them in my front, and I got them in my back. Them bastards won't get away from us this time."
Major General O.P. Smith, commanding general of the 1st Marine Division, ordered Colonel Chesty Puller to send a task force to open up the road between Kotori and Hagaruri, where the majority of the division was. This force became the spearhead of a remarkable fighting withdrawal.
And he proceeded to do a retreat out of the Chosin Reservoir, took the whole 1st Marine Division in the middle of winter and moved them all the way back to Incheon. Took a while and a lot of casualties, but basically fought his way all the way back. And that's exactly what he did. They didn't get away from him. And at that point in time, after that, I guess there was a truce signed in Korea that kind of stopped the war and told them to stay over there on the 38th parallel or higher or else.
As the UN forces retreated from the Chosin Reservoir, the battered foot soldiers needed supplies. All through the retreat, the 119 flying boxcars airdropped whatever the retreating troops needed: ammunition, food, and medical supplies, even jeeps and artillery pieces. In mid-December 1950, the front stabilized near the 38th parallel, and the North American F-86s finally arrived to face the MiGs. Outnumbered 4-1, the F-86s proved their worth. MiG Alley, the wide band of airspace over Northwest Korea, became the setting for the first all-jet air war. In mid-January 1951, the United Nations ground forces mounted a counterattack from the line of their furthest withdrawals. They pounded their way from below the 38th parallel and through the Iron Triangle. In support of the ground forces were the Marines and their F-9F Panthers. Close air support by F-9F Panther jets brought in a new discipline, which took into account the aircraft's high speed and reduced range. There was also concern about the Panther's shallower dive angle because of the jet's higher speed. This reduced angle increased the fighter's exposure to its own bomb fragments after delivery. From the Navy and Marine Corps standpoint, air-to-air action was sporadic, with the Air Force seeing most of the engagements against communist aircraft. At first, the enemy seemed reluctant to commit few modern MiG-15 fighters and sent in World War II veterans like Yak-9 fighters and I-110 ground attack bombers. Corsair pilot Captain Philip C. DeLong shot down 2 Yaks on April 21, 1951, while his wingman, First Lieutenant Harold Dake, accounted for 2 others. DeLong was already an ace in the Pacific with 11 Japanese kills. The Communists also increased their force of MiG-15s by activating a 2nd regiment equipped with the improved MiG-15 BIs. At once, the tempo of air combat increased, and formations of 80 enemy jets were frequently sighted. One of the war's biggest single combats was fought on October 22, 1951, as 8 B-29s, escorted by 55 F-84s and 35 F-86s, were bombing Namsi. Suddenly, 100 MiGs appeared and boxed in the escorts, as 50 other MiGs made for the bombers. They managed to shoot down 3 of the bombers and severely damaged 4 others. 6 MiGs were shot down, and 1 F-84 was lost. As the spring and early summer of 1953 proceeded, the Marine squadrons kept up the pressure, flying countless sorties against enemy lines and installations. Sometimes, their attention made the difference between a communist victory and an outpost remaining in Marine hands. Combat information from Korea was filtered back to the Saber's designers, and in June 1952, an improved Saber, the F-86F, began to be deployed to the 51st Fighter Wing. The F-86F was the first Saber variant which was superior in all respects to the MiG-15s. During the last 6 months of the war, these fighters wholly dominated the skies. By June, the Communists were ready for an armistice. The battle line of mid-June was to remain more or less stabilized throughout the coming peace talks. Finally, word came that July 27th would be the last day of the war. Even as the 7,000 men of the 1st MAW prepared to stand down, the Wing's aircraft flew 222 sorties on that final day. Captain William I. Armagost of VMF 311 flew the last jet mission of the war against Chinese supply areas in the late afternoon, 35 minutes before the ceasefire was to take effect at 1910 hours. During the war, the UN forces downed 827 MiGs. The UN forces lost 112 jet aircraft. It was one of the most successful air campaigns ever. After the war, the USAF reported an F-86 Sabre kill ratio in excess of 10-1, with 792 MiG-15s and 108 other aircraft shot down by Sabres and 78 Sabres lost to enemy fire. Post-war data confirms only 379 Sabre kills. 39 UN pilots became aces. The Soviet Air Force reported some 1,100 air-to-air victories and 335 MiG combat losses. China's People's Liberation Army Air Force reported 231 combat losses, mostly MiG-15s, and 168 other aircraft lost. The KPAF reported no data, but the UN command estimates some 200 KPAF aircraft lost in the war's first stage and 70 additional aircraft after the Chinese intervention. The USAF disputes Soviet and Chinese claims of 650 and 211 downed F-86s respectively, as more recent U.S. figures state only 230 losses out of 674 F-86s deployed to Korea. The differing tactical roles of the F-86 and MiG-15 may have contributed to the disparity in losses. MiG-15s primarily targeted B-29 bombers and ground attack fighter bombers, while F-86s targeted the MiGs. From an air combat viewpoint, the Korean War was historic in that it was the first major conflict in which large numbers of opposing jet fighters engaged each other. It also marked the end of the age of gun-only armament aircraft. The era of the air-to-air missile was about to dawn.